The Untold Story of Malcolm X's Six Daughters, March 21st, 1965. The Audubon Ballroom in Harlem whispers, then gunfire. 6 shots echo. 1 voice dies, but 6 young lives will carry its echoes on. They stare as a father falls. Their world fractures in a heartbeat, yet across decades, each of them will find a way to live on his legacy with love, pain, defiance, art, grief, and quiet dignity. This is their story, a family at a crossroads. They came into this world as prophecy and promise, children being raised by Mala Shabazz, daughters of an evolution, a struggle. A man named Malcolm X who moved as fire and calm. He had 6 daughters, Atala, Kubila, Ilyasah, Gamilah, and twin girls, Malikah and Mala. Their home in Elmhurst, Queens was alive with books, debates, music, reminders that what's broken can be rebuilt, what's silenced can speak again. The Shabbaz home, modest but vibrant, thrummed with ideas. On any given day, young girls could be seen curling up with worn books about revolutionaries, or absorbing their mother's firm yet gentle lessons on dignity, discipline, and love. Malcolm and Betty saw parenting not just as a personal duty, but as a political act. To raise 6 black girls in 1960s, America with pride and principle was itself a radical gesture. Dinner conversations were never shallow. Malcolm read the dictionary to the girls, sometimes line by line, insisting that language would be their freedom. He was a stern but affectionate father, a man who believed that knowledge could both defend and liberate. Even as threats loomed outside, Malcolm made sure his daughters knew joy. He brought home sweets when he could, played games on the living room floor, and let them climb on his back like a playground. But by early 1965, that joy had begun to slip. Surveillance cars were parked outside their house for days at a time. Phone lines clicked with unknown interruptions. On February 14th, their home was firebombed. Betty rushed the girls out barefoot into the cold, their pajamas singed by smoke. Just 1 week later, in front of their eyes, Malcolm was gunned down. The man who had promised them protection and truth now lay still. In the silence that followed, Betty stood alone, pregnant with twins, and already mother to 4 girls under 7. She became both lighthouse and fortress. The loss was not abstract. It bled into their bed sheets, their homework, their bedtime stories. The assassination was a rupture, not just in national history, but in 6 childhoods. These girls would inherit not just a name, but a mythology, and with it, an invisible weight. They would have to learn how to grow in the long shadow of a father the world called legend, but they knew simply as dad. And for each of them, growing up meant something different. Grief wrapped itself around their lives in different colors and shades. Some chose visibility, some chose retreat, some spoke out, some watched silently. But they all carried him, quietly and fiercely, into every room they entered. Atala Shabbaz, born 1958. If the world had seen as much of my father as I did, they'd see the man who loved me, who danced in the kitchen for me. Atala was the eldest, the one with the most direct memories of her father. She was 6 years old when the world tilted, when her father was taken from her in a storm of bullets. And because she was the eldest, the expectations piled up early. There were photos where she looked just like him, eyes full of insight, too old for childhood. She remembers the warmth of his laughter, the scratch of his beard as he kissed her forehead, and the way he would let her sit on his lap while he read the paper, as if shielding her with knowledge. That morning at the Audubon Ballroom remains carved into her psyche, like a bruise that never quite faded. She remembers clinging to her mother's skirt, the chaos around her erupting like thunder. Her father's body crumpled to the floor just a few feet away. She saw too much too soon, and in the years that followed, she carried that trauma like an invisible burn. In school, Atala was often withdrawn. The burden of being Malcolm X's daughter meant living in the double shadow of fame and grief. She grew rebellious, then remorseful. Teenage pregnancy came early. Conflicted and overwhelmed, she gave her baby up for adoption, a decision that lingered in her heart for years. Yet Betty, steadfast as ever, stepped in, provided care, and never let Atala feel abandoned. Then came the pivotal friendship. In 1979, Atala met Yolanda King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter. Daughters of icons, daughters of martyrs. Their bond became a form of therapy, a form of resistance. They launched Nucleus, a touring theater project rooted in heritage and healing. They performed for students across the nation, young black children who saw in them a mirror and a map. Their productions weren't just dramatic pieces. They were acts of translation, turning pain into poetry, memory into mission. The duo became cultural emissaries, a symbolic reconciliation of 2 ideological legacies, Malcolm and Martin, fire and dream. Atala matured into a multifaceted force. She wrote, she spoke, she created. Her words carried the cadence of her father's speeches, but softened with the lyrical tone of her own evolution. She traveled internationally as a cultural ambassador, always returning to her roots with grace. She didn't seek celebrity, but Purpose. Her mission was to humanize Malcolm, to let the world see the father beneath the revolutionary. As decades passed, Atala became the family's matriarch. She carried the stories. She anchored the reunions. She stood on stages not just to speak, but to witness. Her life became a living archive, a memoir in motion, and in her 60s, she remains the beating heart of the Shabbaz sisters, elegant, wise, and forever reaching toward the light her father believed they were all born to find. Kubila Shabbaz, born 1960, is like I was set on fire, born in flames and cannot shake the scorching. Kubila Shabbaz's life began in proximity to trauma. At 4 years old, she was the first to wake up the night their home was firebombed, February 14, 1965. Her scream roused the family, giving them just enough time to escape the blaze. That moment alone would be enough to alter a childhood, but fate dealt her another blow just 1 week later. She stood in the Audubon ballroom that day, a small child with wide eyes, when Malcolm X, her father, was assassinated in front of her and the rest of the family. Those images, though blurry in memory, would ripple through her subconscious for decades. Qubilah grew up under a storm cloud. Unlike her older sister Atala, she didn't remember much warmth before the storm. Her earliest sense of self was shaped not by her father's guidance, but by his absence, by headlines, and by the whispered speculation surrounding his death. As a teenager, she was restless. She attended high school in New York and was bright, gifted even. But the weight of her father's name trailed her like a second skin. She enrolled at Princeton University in the late 1970s, perhaps seeking space to find her voice. But the pressure, both external and internal, proved too intense. She left after just 2 semesters. She then moved to Paris in her early 20s, a kind of exile, a hope for reinvention. There, she found brief refuge, working as a translator and raising her young son, Malcolm, named after her father. The name was less about legacy and more about continuity, about holding on to something real. But the relationship with her son's father ended, and soon, Qubilah found herself back in the U.S., a single mother still seeking peace. In 1995, her life took a drastic turn, gripped by years of unresolved anger and suspicion, particularly toward Louis Farrakhan, whom the Shabbaz family believed bore some responsibility for Malcolm X's death. Qubilah became entangled in a shocking legal scandal. She was charged in a plot to assassinate Farrakhan. She had allegedly approached someone she believed could help her carry out the murder, but that person turned out to be an FBI informant. The news exploded. The daughter of Malcolm X wrapped in a murder-for-hire plot. Some saw her as a woman, unraveling beneath the weight of grief and generational pain. Others saw her as a cautionary tale. Qubilah denied ever intending to carry through with the plan. Eventually, she struck a plea deal, mandatory psychiatric treatment and rehab, but no jail time. Betty Shabbaz stood by her daughter throughout the ordeal, unwavering in maternal loyalty. She even agreed to take in Qubilah's then 10-year-old son, Malcolm, hoping to provide him with the stability Qubilah struggled to maintain. Tragically, this choice led to another family catastrophe. In 1997, young Malcolm set a fire in Betty's apartment. She suffered burns over 80% of her body and died 3 weeks later. Qubilah was once again swallowed by grief, this time double-layered. Her son had caused the death of her mother. In 2013, her son was killed in a violent altercation in Mexico, closing another tragic chapter. Today, Qubilah lives quietly, far from the spotlight. She has seen fire, loss, exile, and shame. Yet she remains. Scarred, perhaps, but enduring. The flame that once threatened to consume her is now a quiet, flickering candle, burning not in rage, but in remembrance. Ilasa Shabbaz, born 1962. My father wasn't angry, he was responding to the urgent outrage of injustice. Ilasa Shabbaz was just 2 years old when her father was assassinated, too young to carry a single vivid memory of him. And yet, her life has been spent assembling a mosaic of who he was, from stories, books, old photographs, and the careful words of her mother, Betty. She grew up in a household where history hung on the walls and whispered through the furniture, where the man everyone else saw as radical was memorialized as Daddy, a warm, thoughtful, and deeply principled father. Unlike some of her sisters, Ilyasah did not experience the trauma of that day with conscious memory, but its aftershocks reverberated throughout her upbringing. The grief was woven into their routines. The name Malcolm X meant both reverence and burden. Children at school would gawk. Teachers treated her differently. She learned early how the myth of her father eclipsed the intimacy of her own childhood. She didn't rebel like some of her siblings. Instead, she studied. She pursued education with a quiet fire. At SUNY New Paltz, she earned a degree in biology. Later, she received a master's degree in education and human resource development from Fordham University. Ilyasah seemed destined for a conventional academic path, perhaps a life spent helping others in quiet classrooms. But something shifted. As she grew into adulthood, she realized that education was not just a career, it was also a platform. She began to speak publicly, not just about herself, but about her father's true character. In 2002, she published Growing Up X, a memoir that offered a rare, tender portrait of what it was like to be Malcolm X's daughter. The book humanized the icon. It reminded readers that beyond the revolutionary speeches, Malcolm was also a man who loved reading to his daughters and teaching them the power of words. The memoir was followed by more literary work, including X, a young adult novel about Malcolm's early years. The book won awards and introduced her father's humanity to a new generation. Ilyasah didn't just inherit a legacy, she shaped it. She didn't simply preserve her father's image, she redefined it for those who only knew him as a symbol of rage. In recent years, Ilyasah has become a regular presence at universities, civil rights forums, and on television. Her voice is calm, unwavering, informed. She speaks about historical injustice, about how we remember Black icons, and about the systemic failures that persist to this day. She has become her father's most articulate defender and most compelling translator, offering nuance to a world that often prefers caricature. In 2021, when two men wrongfully convicted of her father's assassination were exonerated, Ilyasah stood tall, not with vengeance, but with purpose. In 2024, she joined several of her sisters and attorney Ben Crump to file a $100 million lawsuit against the FBI, NYPD, and CIA, alleging a deliberate conspiracy to silence her father. For her, the lawsuit wasn't about money. It was about truth, about restoring dignity not just to Malcolm X, but to the family that survived him. Today, Ilyasah is not just a speaker or a writer. She is a vessel of legacy. Her life is a bridge between past and present, between myth and man. She shows us that to truly understand Malcolm X, we must listen to those who knew him best, and few know him better than the daughter who has spent her life giving him back to the world one word at a time. Camila Shabbaz, born 1964. Sometimes preserving a legacy means not shouting it, but living it in every quiet choice you make. Camila Shabbaz was just a baby when her father was assassinated, 6 months old, cradled in her mother's arms inside the Audubon Ballroom on that fateful February day in 1965. She doesn't remember the chaos, the screams, the gunfire, but absence for her was a constant companion. She grew up in a house where the air still remembered what had been lost. Malcolm X had chosen her middle name, Lumumba, in honor of Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese independence leader assassinated just a few years earlier. That choice, intentional and symbolic, was Malcolm's final gift to his fifth daughter, an inheritance of pride, resistance, and international Black solidarity. But it was also a weight. Gamilah's name alone marked her as someone meant for something larger than herself, even before she could walk. Unlike some of her older sisters who grew up amid the height of civil rights tension, Gamilah experienced a slightly quieter version of that turmoil. By the time she entered school, the country was already beginning to mythologize her father. He was no longer the active target of surveillance or scorn. He was history, revered and feared in equal measure. In her classes, she was the daughter of a martyr, but at home, she was just Gamilah, the quieter one. From a young age, she gravitated toward the arts. She studied theater and immersed herself in creative expression, experimenting for a time with music, even exploring rap during its early years as a cultural revolution. But Gamilah wasn't drawn to the spotlight. She didn't want to carry her father's torch in front of a crowd. Instead, she found meaning in intimacy, in close collaborations, in whispered tributes rather than shouted slogans. She lived for a time in New York, then Los Angeles, and maintained her privacy with a discipline that reflected both pain and wisdom. She never fully detached from her father's legacy, but she chose to engage with it on her own terms. In 2018, Gamilah joined all 5 of her sisters in launching the Malcolm X Legacy clothing line, a bold, creative enterprise that sought to reclaim their father's image from corporate distortion. Tired of seeing Malcolm's likeness on t-shirts and mugs stripped of context or meaning, the sisters created apparel that spoke to their father's true ideology: self-respect, pride, knowledge, and action. Gamilah played a key role in the design and messaging of the brand. It wasn't about fashion, it was about narrative control. Through this project, she helped educate young consumers, turning garments into lessons, turning style into substance. Publicly, Gamilah remains the most reserved of the Shabbaz daughters. She rarely gives interviews, appears infrequently at public events, and prefers to work behind the scenes. But her presence in the family remains deeply felt. She's the quiet pillar, the one who listens before she speaks, the one who makes sure every project, every gathering, honors the spirit of their father without sensationalism. To many, she may appear distant from the spotlight, but in truth, Gamilah's life is an embodiment of Malcolm X's most consistent value: integrity. She teaches us that living out a legacy doesn't always mean repeating it loudly. Sometimes it means preserving it quietly, fiercely, and with unwavering devotion. Malikah and Mala Shabazz, born 1965. Malikah died 2021. We were born from grief, but not broken by it. Malikah and Mala Shabazz were the final gift Malcolm X left behind. Twin daughters still in their mother's womb when he was gunned down in the Audubon ballroom. Born 7 months after his assassination, they entered the world already wrapped in mourning. Betty Shabbaz named them with care, drawing from their father's adopted Muslim name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabbaz. Malikah, meaning queen, and Mala, often interpreted as a soft derivative of angel or messenger, were not just names. They were reminders of presence through absence, of purpose through tragedy. Unlike their older sisters, the twins did not experience the firebombing of their home or the direct trauma of witnessing their father's death, but they grew up surrounded by its residue. The silence of absence became their lullaby. In their early years, they would often ask about the man in the photograph, the one who smiled without moving, the one their mother called your father. Betty would sit them down and explain his legacy, his fight, his love. There's a famous story. When one of the twins was asked by a friend who her daddy was, she pointed to the large portrait on the wall and declared proudly, "That's my father." Raised in a post-civil rights America that both glorified and sanitized Malcolm X's image, Malikah and Mala had to carve out identities independent of mythology. They weren't the little girls at the rallies or on the evening news. They were the ones who grew up watching their sisters wrestle with visibility and expectation. And so, perhaps as a kind of emotional survival, both leaned toward quieter, more structured lives. Malikah pursued studies in architecture. She found comfort in blueprints and the certainty of measurements, perhaps seeking order after a childhood shaped by chaos. She also involved herself in community mentorship, at one point launching a youth initiative for African teens, quietly echoing her parents' mission to uplift and educate. Mala, similarly, immersed herself in science, focusing on biochemistry. She gravitated toward the medical and humanitarian side of things, later participating in panels and speaking engagements commemorating her father. In 1998, a year after their mother's tragic death, Malikah became a mother herself, naming her daughter Betty Bajia, a loving homage to the grandmother she had lost. The birth of her daughter marked a hopeful moment in a family so often defined by loss. But life for Malikah was not without turbulence. In the years that followed, she encountered legal trouble related to financial disputes and identity theft charges. While the media headlines resurfaced the Shabbaz name in a negative light, her sisters rallied quietly, shielding her from judgment. She faced consequences, learned from the mistakes, and focused on raising her daughter with dignity. In November 2021, tragedy struck again. Malikah was found unresponsive in her Brooklyn home by her daughter. She was only 56. No foul play was suspected, and it was later confirmed that she had been ill for some time. The timing of her death was chilling. It occurred just days after the formal exoneration of 2 men who had been wrongfully convicted of assassinating Malcolm X. The coincidence felt almost mythic, as though her spirit had held on until that final chapter was corrected. Mala, the younger twin by a few minutes, bore the weight of that loss with visible sorrow. Already someone who had chosen privacy over public platforms, she stepped up in small but meaningful ways after Malikah's passing, appearing at events, honoring her father's memory, and helping her family move forward in unity. Together, the twins represent both the continuation and the quiet evolution of Malcolm X's legacy. Born after his death, they were never touched by his hand, but shaped profoundly by his shadow. Their lives remind us that the work of legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's found in the small things: raising a daughter, designing a building, keeping a family together. The weight, the gift. 6 daughters, 6 unique expressions of a single world-shaking loss. Together, they are the full portrait of Malcolm X, not just the man who spoke truth to power, but the father who left behind a constellation of lives shaped by his shadow. Atala, the eldest, became the family's voice, a bridge between past and future, echoing her father's cadence in poetry and diplomacy. Kubila, the restless spirit, wandered through fire, loss, and personal collapse, only to emerge, wounded but still standing. Ilyasah, the scholar and writer, transformed grief into dialogue, carrying her father's truth into courtrooms and classrooms. Gamilah, the quiet architect, kept the legacy rooted, shaping it in subtle, beautiful ways. Malikah and Mala, born from the silence that followed, became twin testaments to resilience. One now gone, the other still watching, still listening. Their mother, Betty Shabbaz, held them all through assassinations, courtrooms, jail cells, and funerals. She never asked to be a widow at 28 or a martyr's gatekeeper, yet she carried the flame with unspeakable grace. Her love formed the architecture of their survival. Together, the Shabbaz sisters did not simply survive tragedy, they evolved with it. They built careers, raised children, mourned losses, and built memorials. Some gave speeches, others gave silence. All carried the memory of a man the world revered and misunderstood in equal measure. And And through them, we've come to see that Malcolm X was not just a revolutionary, but a father with bedtime stories, a man who brought home candy and danced in the kitchen. Their story invites us to ask, what becomes of a legacy when it's inherited not by historians, but by children, not by politicians, but by daughters? The answer perhaps is this: it lives, quietly, fiercely, imperfectly, but it lives. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who only knows Malcolm X as a face on a t-shirt or a line in a textbook. Read Growing Up X by Ilasa Shabbaz. Explore the Malcolm X legacy brand and hear the voices of the women who lived through what history barely remembers. These daughters didn't just inherit a name, they rebuilt it. Let their stories remind you that behind every icon is a family forever changed. Subscribe for more forgotten legacies and untold stories, because history isn't just what happens, it's what survives.